And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and joining us now is Kathleen Frydl. She is the author of two books, The GI Bill and The Drug Wars in America, 1940 to 1973. She is a political historian, and she is the author of a recent article entitled Taking Liberties about Catholic hospitals and the Conscience Clause. Kathleen, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. Now, first, tell me about Taking Liberties. What's that article about, briefly?
That article grew out of research I'm doing for a book I'm writing on Catholic hospitals. And I find Catholic hospitals to be very interesting and important actors. You know, you would think that that's just, you know, a small segment of the healthcare industry, but in fact, Catholic hospitals are the largest private healthcare hospital network in the country, and they're only growing in power. And I find that interesting, and I also find it interesting from the perspective of a progressive and a Catholic. So as I was delving into the research on the history of Catholic hospitals in the modern era, I discovered a few surprising things, and I decided to turn it into an article. So one of the surprising things I discovered is that in the era prior to Roe v. Wade, which recognized that a woman's right to privacy included a right to an abortion, so in the era immediately before that, as abortion legalization was spreading between and among the various states, the most serious conversation that was taking place inside the Catholic Church was not how to resist abortion legalization, but actually how its hospitals would go about providing abortion. So I found that to be surprising and very interesting. And
it is interesting, and if I may interrupt just for
please.
a second, what was their plan at that time? Were they going to get outside doctors or somehow subcontract or create a kind of legal fiction to distance themselves?
In fact, none of those things. It's important to realize that then as now, the majority of personnel who work in Catholic hospitals are not Catholic, and the majority of patients who are seen in Catholic hospitals are not Catholic.
I was born in a Catholic hospital.
So was I.
Yeah.
So was I. And so Catholic hospitals, you know, at this time, from 1968, which is the first kind of legal abortion that was provided in Colorado, all the way to 1973, which is the Roe v. Wade decision, there's a tremendous array of Catholic hospitals. There are two orders of women religious, and that's a term of art we use to basically refer to sisters and nuns. There are two orders that run most of the hospitals in the United States, but there's about 30 different orders that have only one hospital. So it's really a very kind of variegated landscape of Catholic hospitals. And the sisters, the women religious, sometimes, you know, listened to the bishops and heeded Catholic doctrine, and sometimes did not, you know. And this is kind of
interesting.
Yeah, this is kind of an interest. There's an interesting gender dynamic that has a very long history in the Catholic Church, and that gender dynamic can be particularly pointed when it comes to stewardship of Catholic assets and Catholic, you know, properties. And the women religious felt that their blood, sweat, and tears went into building these institutions, and sometimes they ceded very willingly to what the bishop would say, and sometimes they just didn't, right?
So, well, that's fascinating in and of itself. We're talking with historian Kathleen Frydl, because there's a kind of feminist subtext to the power dynamic, the history of the power relationships here, right?
Absolutely, and I actually doubt that very few of the women religious would actually cast it in those terms, but they would cast it, I think, in terms of autonomy and expertise. And for many of them, you know, one of the things that I say kind of in the book that I'm working on, but didn't make it into this piece, it's important to realize that Catholic hospitals, you know, in the era prior to World War II, they were like orphanages or foundling homes. They were unloved, impoverished institutions. And like American Catholics themselves, Catholic hospitals kind of evolved from wretched to respectable and actually money-making in the era of World War II and beyond. So as Catholic hospitals began to make kind of real money, bishops became more interested in managing them over time, right? So it is a very, at points, tested and testy relationship between the male clergy and the women religious. But in any event, women religious were stewarding these Catholic hospitals, and most of them, not all of them, had an ethical and religious directives for Catholic hospitals, and that's kind of the corporate charter identity of these nonprofit charitable institutions. But all of the women religious and the professional organization for Catholic hospitals, called the Catholic Hospital Association, all of them understood that nonprofit charities had certain obligations. They're nonprofit corporations, but they're different from strictly religious properties. Strictly religious properties like a church, a synagogue, a mosque, have all kinds of First Amendment privileges and rights. But they also have First Amendment limitations. For instance, the government—
on speech, for example.
And the government could never write checks to a Catholic church or a synagogue or a mosque. But they write checks to hospitals all the time. In fact, the government's increasing hand in the management of hospitals and in just the everyday function of them is what led Women Religious and the Catholic Hospital Association to conclude that in some manner and in some way they would have to provide abortion in certain circumstances when they were the only hospital in the area, for instance. And that's kind of been the subject of recent lawsuits, so it continues to be a bone of contention. But again, prior to Roe v. Wade, they recognized, look, under certain circumstances, even though this goes against our policies, we will have to provide this care if it's legal and medically advised. And so the article—
And Kathleen Frydl, you talk about this in your article, Taking Liberties. You tell the story of one woman, I think she was in Muskegon or somewhere, who that was the only hospital in the area, was the Catholic hospital. They denied her services. And I'm a little— I haven't looked at this in many years, but I believe that hospitals also need a certificate of need, and the government makes decisions about how many will be where and so forth. So in other words, Catholic hospitals, like any hospital, function within that determination of need, those government reimbursement programs that determine how much they'll get and review their budget and set rates accordingly. So they're not existing in a moral vacuum, let's say, the way that a church or a synagogue would be, right?
Extremely well put, and it's actually a joy to do an interview with somebody who knows so much about healthcare, because when I've done interviews for this piece, many people don't understand the extent to which the government is involved in private hospitals. It's not just reimbursing from Medicare and Medicaid, which in and of themselves, those are extremely significant programs. In the era of World War II and beyond, there was something called the Hill-Burton Hospital Construction Act. So many Catholic hospitals had capital investments. They were built or rehabilitated off of government money. And in addition, as you point out, and people don't know this outside of the healthcare industry, that hospitals have to get a certificate of need. One of the ways in which the government has decided to try to manage the costs of the healthcare industry is to essentially limit the supply to what is needed. In other words, if you build out 5 different hospitals, that are not necessary and unneeded, what we found is in the hospital, contrary to normal economic patterns, there's actually an economist who has a rule that says an empty bed will be a filled bed when it comes to the hospital, right?
They've also found this in studies about MRIs, for example. When MRI technology was coming out, they found that San Antonio has 1 MRI. It operates at 80% capacity. It has 2 MRIs. They both operate at 80% capacity.
Exactly.
So, yeah, this is really important for people to understand, because I think the other piece that you got into in your article, Kathleen Frydl, and we're talking with Kathleen, who is his political historian, the other aspect of this that you got into, and you touched on it already, is that people, I think, assume when they hear religious hospital that there is some sort of First Amendment or constitutional right not to do things they find morally objectionable, whereas, as you point out, this was granted by the Congress, not by the Constitution, right?
Yes, and in fact, you just got to the very heart of the article. I try to tell the story of how it is we came to look upon Catholic hospitals as if they had First Amendment rights, as opposed to the way in which the Catholics managing these hospitals looked upon them themselves, which is as nonprofit charities with certain obligations to the community. And what I found is, first of all, there's a contest, if you will, within the Catholic Church between Catholic traditionalists and those who want to follow the teachings of Vatican II, which are seen, I mean, you could summarize those teachings as more liberal. A lot of people would say, they're not necessarily more liberal, but this was a major battleground within the Catholic Church. And Catholic traditionalists were eager to go back to an era of just, rote obedience to the catechism, no individual questioning, all this kind of stuff.
Right. You had Pope John, I think, was really the leader of Vatican II. Then a lot of people felt that John Paul II was bringing the church back in the other direction.
The revanchist.
Right. And you had schismatics even in France and
Yes.
elsewhere who say it's no longer the true church, and so you have this whole history, this
Yes.
internal civil war. And how do hospitals figure into that?
So within the hospitals, women religious understood that as nonprofit charities, there were community obligations, and in addition to that, there was a whole array of civil rights jurisprudence taking place in this country where different private bodies, so ostensibly private corporate entities, were viewed by courts as public entities for the purpose of constitutional rights, when and if the government was heavily involved in their business.
Mm-hmm.
That's certainly true of the hospitals.
Sure.
So on the one hand, the women religious and many of their allies and many theologians were saying, look, even though it goes against our policies, there is an individual right to conscience, and we should provide this service under these certain circumstances, in the event of an emergency, in the event of a woman's life in danger, if we're the only hospital in the area, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The traditionalists posited an argument very late in the day, so to speak, as this was a long-running debate, saying actually a Catholic church is a Catholic hospital is a religious entity, and it has a right to conscience.
Now, who postulated this? Who made this argument first?
Okay, so it's difficult to...
And I have a reason for asking, as you can imagine.
Okay, well, I'm interested to hear the reason, because
okay,
it's
I'll tell you the reason.
Okay.
Because I have this crazy theory, okay? Call it a wild and crazy theory, that perhaps the church was originally willing to do things like perform abortions, but perhaps those who have the political agenda of eliminating a woman's right to an abortion thought they could use Catholic hospitals and other religious institutions as leverage by acting in the political sphere to treat it as if it were a constitutional right, so that the legislators who passed that law really were pushing their own anti-abortion agenda rather than this being a natural evolution of some kind.
So,
is that a crazy conspiracy
theory? No,
it's
not a crazy conspiracy theory, but I want to let your viewers and listeners in on my book. So this is not in the article, but this is in the book. What the Catholic hospitals actually serve as leverage on is not just eliminating or severely limiting a woman's right to choose. By establishing their autonomy as private entities, they're actually doing the work of the American Hospital Association as it battles plans for national health care reform.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
So the other subtext here is a diminishing of the government's authority over hospitals as institutions. In other words, so does it tie in a way with this whole privatization wave of all sorts of government managed and government run or government coordinated functions are being, no, we're privatized, we don't have to submit to the rule of the people or whatever?
Yes, and again, and I'm kind of dropping a little bit the thesis of the book, but we forget, as progressives, we forget how hotly contested the issue of national health care was throughout the entire 1970s. People tend to remember Truman proposing it. They, of course, remember Medicare and Medicaid in 64 and 65. But they forget how close we came to national health care several times during the 1970s. And I'm talking about under Nixon, I'm talking about a little bit under Ford, and especially under Carter. And the Catholic Church would join the institutional church, I should say, would join family planning and community health care planning together into one anathema. Right?
Okay.
So let me just leave that there, if I may, and get back to the conscious, because I don't want to give away everything to do with the book,
and we
but that's
only
a
have
teaser.
a couple minutes left anyway, so we'll allow you to hold something in reserve.
So what's interesting to me is the Catholic traditionalists who posit this, okay, this is a religious institution, this hospital, we're just anointing it a religious institution. What's interesting to me is they don't win that argument within the Catholic Church. They actually, it's a stalemate between them and the forces you could describe as more progressive. They have to avail themselves of the U.S. political system, and in particular Congress, and a federal conscience clause in order to essentially win this argument and establish, at least politically, not legally, but politically, that a hospital, a Catholic hospital, is an entity with religious freedom. Now, no Catholic hospital has been asked to defend that in court, and I very seriously doubt that they could.
And from a theological perspective, what happened to rendering unto Caesar that which is Caesar's?
That's a chapter title in my book.
I'm sorry, I blew it.
I never should have done this interview.
Well, I hope you will come back anyway, because the article Taking Liberties is fascinating. The issue is important, resonates in a number of different ways throughout our politics today, in my mind, including the pharmacists who don't want to dispense.
Oh, yes.
I mean, there's an enormous, and my answer to that is always, then don't become a pharmacist, because if it violates your conscience, you know, if you're a Zoroastrian, don't become a firefighter. You know, I mean, I think that, so this is, but I think there's a clear connection here. So there are all sorts of, your book, your upcoming book, intersects with all sorts of forces, privatization, anti-government feeling in general, in conservatism, the expansion of the First Amendment, where I believe it was never intended to go, and those sorts of things.
It does.
So, 30 seconds.
It does, but my 30-second close will be another interesting component of the story is that we would never have the Affordable Care Act today were it not for Catholic hospitals. So the name of my book is called Enlarge the Place of Your Tent, which comes from Isaiah 54:2. And I'll get it wrong here, but the psalm is essentially enlarge the place of your tent, put your stakes in the ground, for you will expand to the right and to the left. And the legacy of Catholic hospitals is precisely that. We would not have the politics, not just in healthcare, but we would not have the politics that we do today on the right and on the left were it not for Catholic hospitals.
But maybe we'd have Medicare for all.
There are people on the left in Catholic hospitals who very much want that.
Okay. All right. Well, Kathleen Frydl, political historian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.